Okay, welcome to the Longing for God podcast, Roger Castillo. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Mhm. So, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your childhood. I've read your biography on the website. It says you were born in Malta in 1973.
Yes, that's,
And yeah, I was just curious about if you could tell me a little bit about how your childhood was.
um, as far as my recollection goes, and I guess I say that because we sometimes don't know what we don't know. Um,
Hmm.
I had a, a great childhood. I suppose going off my experience as a child being alive, I guess I used to be pretty excited about waking up in the morning and going out in the garden and playing. Going to school. I guess I didn't really like the classes that much, but I was always very excited to go out and play and explore things with friends and, um, get home in the afternoon, ride around on the bicycle. Um, and so I had a family, a mother and father that were married and lived together, and a father who was very keen to always, do his best to provide, and a mother who also, in her way, um, be loving and provide what was needed. Had a sister, so my my feeling about my childhood is that I was one of the lucky ones in a sense, in that I didn't have to deal with any,
Mm.
um, any really traumatic circumstances, or find myself living with, parents that had very significant, I don't know, alcohol problems or anything like that.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because, a lot of people that turn to a spiritual path can do it motivated by wanting to get away from suffering and either have difficult childhoods or have had difficulty at some point in their life and then move towards spirituality as an alternative to that life experience.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
interesting to hear that you had quite a nice childhood. It sounds like from all um, perspectives, it seems like it was pretty idyllic. Do you know what it was that motivated you on the spiritual search?
Yeah, well, just in relation to the childhood, I think understanding my personality explains why. So I tend to be a bit of a loner, or happy to do things on my own, not be particularly dependent on people. And so as a child, I think I was very happy to go off. And so my parents, I guess, didn't find me much trouble in the sense that I'd go off and entertain myself. And frankly, I was happy if they left me alone.
Mm,
I was happy to be left alone.
mm,
They were probably,
mhm,
um, no need to disturb that side of things. So a large part of it was, I mean, obviously I was very lucky in they provided the infrastructure where I didn't have to worry about, food and clothes, and I had a nice school, had access to friends. They'd drive me to people's houses if I needed that, and that type of thing. But the fact that I was independent in a way, I think, meant um, a certain degree of extraction from, even if it was if I happened to be in a problematic environment, my attitude. Well, I don't know if it was an attitude, but just the way I found myself is I would just go off into my little world and find that, find entertainment, or be at
mhm,
peace there. So I've
mm,
often
mm,
looked back at my seeking, and said it wasn't seeking, because that interest, I think about things a lot, and I find a topic I don't know, and I am happy to dive into it and learn, and sometimes projects, that extend over years. So
mm,
I didn't find myself in this state of feeling like I was in limbo, in childhood, and then over into my teenage years, and then early 20s, um, and so seeking wasn't driven by this deep suffering. I just came across information. As I said, I liked information accidentally in a way, picked up a book at a friend's house and was on my way to the beach, and it came about, started reading this book that I just had as a prop, really. I didn't really intend to read the book, and it had a lot of sort of psychological and slash spiritual ideas in it. And I was always very interested in how we function, what makes us function, why we, why we're different, why we might make decisions the way we make decisions. And this seemed to be it was a book called Stop Thinking and Start Living. And it sort of literally just fell into my hands.
Who was the book? Who was the author?
I can't remember the author, but the name of the book was Stop Thinking and Start Living.
Okay, yeah.
He's a PhD. It'll come to me. I usually know his name. And it just had information in it that I thought, why hasn't anyone told me this? And obviously, there's all sorts of that sort of information out there, but I just didn't realize. And so I just devoured that book, and so much so that I felt like I was going to start earning money by going door to door selling this book. I just felt that. It wasn't so much that book in hindsight. If I reread the book, I'm sure there's plenty of things in there that wouldn't resonate anymore. But it was just the fact that a portal opened up to that sort of information that started to explain things that, I'd think about these things, but my thinking wasn't structured enough or informed enough to come up with comprehensive reasonings for things. And reading the book, it just seemed to have so much more than I was capable of coming up with on my own. And so then it started for the next many years. I just read book after book after book after book. And it wasn't just about reading for me. It wasn't about just information. The way that seemed to assimilate for me was the information would come in and it wouldn't remain as knowledge. It would inspire an investigation that then revealed in a non-intellectual way, because you're actually investigating what the concepts are talking about and seeing it in action. And so that to me is a much deeper landing, and that is what tends to transform, I think. And so it moved from maybe more psychological in the beginning, and very quickly turned into sort of top-down Advaita teachings, and like Wei Wu Wei and the Tao Te Ching, Buddha's teachings, Nisargadatta, Ramana, and many others.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that book for me was The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. That was my gateway drug, if you will, into the spiritual world. Before that, I was not interested or not aware, and after reading that book, I was hooked. Yeah, so it sounds like a similar sort of experience.
Yeah, that's right, and I can relate to that. Was on the list, not too far down the time span. So that is a great set of pointings in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you spoke about Ramana and you spoke about Nisargadatta and the top-down Advaita stuff. And then at one point you met Ramesh. I can see a photo of Ramesh Balsekar on the dresser there behind you.
Yes.
And I've heard you speak about your first encounter with Ramesh a few times, and I find that story really interesting. I was wondering if you could tell me, how you came across Ramesh, and then what your relationship was like with him initially, and then how it unfolded.
Well, I guess this brings us into the topic of the difference in teachings, and I'll give you some context as to, so in the late 1998, 99, I guess is when I started getting interested because of this information that came. Before that, I was interested, but in my own world, I didn't realize it was a subject out there discussed about. And so in the early, around 2000, 2001, I think a lot of the non-dual awakening type shifts had started to happen because of the pointings in the texts that kept describing life as not separate and what we are as not physical. conscious awareness in which the whole experience of life arises and is one with. And so those continuous pointers repeating, in with the new or out with the old, in with the new, essentially. And those concepts would say, you've got it wrong. The system is misperceiving reality. And there was a motivation, I guess, inside to see the truth, to see clearly. And I think that's why teachings describe things in terms of ignorance and truth, because it's natural motivation to move away from misunderstanding towards understanding. So I'd say early on, that opened that shift opened up, and that's pretty significant because I think it means that the structures, internal structures, have shifted sufficiently or changed sufficiently for the perception or the experiential representation of life to reveal what was being pointed at in the teachings. And you think that that's it, that often is what is described as liberation, is this shift in perception. Awakening is the word that I would use. And it, in my experience, wasn't, and there's plenty of evidence out there in the teaching, in various teachings, that suggest it isn't. And one of the sayings in Zen that speaks to this, well, there's two actually. One is awakening is spontaneous and deliverance is gradual. And so then someone would need to define those means. And I would say the awakening is a sudden shift of seeing things, and that might persist or it might come and go. But then there is this other period of deliverance, which is an integration of that understanding that has created a shift, and an integration of that into more levels or all levels of the system, such that the embodiment of the understanding becomes consistent and meaningful in the sense that it translates into something rather than just remaining as an experience, or prior to any of that, just knowledge as in intellectual knowledge. And so Ramana and Nisargadatta's teaching were very important in maintaining that new perspective and making sure that there was a familiarity and a grounding in that, because their teachings continued to reinforce that perspective. Essentially, form is an illusion. The world is not real. What is real is what you are. That is prior to the form that it appears to be. So, and that was, that was very profound. There are a lot of peak experiences. It's pretty mystical, and ironically, you tend to get quite a few false ideas, false beliefs that get put in place as part of those teachings. So they need to say things in a certain way, and inevitably, some of those things are going to be locked away in a way that's not necessarily as intended or clear seeing. So meeting Ramesh in 2005 was also a bit of an accident, in that I was deeply involved and connected to Nisargadatta's teaching, and I came across something online that mentioned Ramesh and daily talks in Mumbai, and that Ramesh was Nisargadatta's translator. And so I was planning a trip to Europe, and I decided that I'd add in a 36-hour stopover in Mumbai, just to pay my respects, not to Ramesh, but to Nisargadatta. And I sort of had this image of Ramesh being sort of a conduit to Nisargadatta, especially given he was the translator. And I wasn't familiar with Ramesh's teachings, or so I really wasn't going for Ramesh. And furthermore, I sort of put aside 36 hours as a stopover, just enough time to, make it from the hotel to the morning satsang, pay my respects, and then be on the plane, that evening sort of thing.
Mhm.
And as it so happened, in that first day, I went to the satsang, and then that afternoon it started raining and raining and raining, and turns out to be one of the heaviest downpours in Mumbai, and there were quite a few deaths, unfortunately, from flooding. But the long and the short of it is the airport was closed for 10 days. And so my 36 hours turned into 10 days, ultimately at Ramesh's feet, is how it ended up. And there's a fun story there. But so destiny or life put me where I needed to be, because Ramesh's teaching was essentially, okay, now come down from up there, and you need to live as Roger.
Mm.
Now that's not what the other teachings that had such a profound effect on me were saying. They were saying Roger doesn't exist, and
Yeah.
you are formless awareness. Now that's important, but Ramesh went to great lengths to point out that we have to continue to live as this human being until the body dies, and maybe that's all that life really is about, is going full circle, such that we end up being able to live as Roger or Maitreya, but with a different attitude, different relationship to life and to what we are at our core, which leads to a life still with pleasure and pain in it, but absent of the suffering, the psychological suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the definition in this teaching of what liberation and enlightenment is. And it doesn't focus so much on states, but focuses on the fact that if certain structures, belief structures, that cause a particular identification with things that are much more impermanent than certain parts of ourselves that are much less changing. If those structures change, then we can find ourselves connected to a part of ourselves that allows for this peace of mind, the absence of suffering, to be a reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that part of the story where you were intending to stay for 36 hours and, the flooding happened and you ended up staying for 10 days.
Mm.
And what sense do you make of that? Like, in your mind, is that coincidence, or in your mind, is that the universe giving you a helping hand in the direction you needed to go? What sense do you make of it?
Well, going back many years to that point in time, the funny part is that each day you never knew when the airport was going to open. So it was a sort of, each day you'd wake up and think, okay, today is the day I'm leaving. And it wasn't until it was. Back then my idea of destiny and predetermination was a little different to what it is now. I'm still pretty clear that what I call destiny is that which turns out in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so even, there'll be many people who hear the word destiny and would say, oh, I don't believe in destiny. That's probably because they have a specific idea of what that word, they'd have an interpretation of destiny that is a particular interpretation that might be linked to God or something specific. And what they don't believe in is maybe God, or that there is a conscious force, i.e. God, dictating things or creating things.
Mm-hmm.
You reframe it another way, and I just say destiny is what happens, and the reality is that only one thing ever happens
Mm-hmm.
in life. Now, there's infinite potential, you could say, but the truth is that what turns out is one thing only. And so I am very happy to say life is destined. And so the fact that that happened, as far as I look at it, is it's destined. It was destined. It happened. Um, so I might not have the same definition that says various things, but and I think life is mysterious and wonderful. So it's enough for me to think about it as it it that was my life, and it included it. I don't have a problem with going steps further and saying that I think life is probably more than it appears to be, and there was possibly some reason why that happened that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the idea of a block such that it's not necessarily A leads to B leads to C leads to D, but it could be that D also leads to C leads to B leads to A. And so if something at the end has happened, then all the things beforehand need to fit in place to make that happen. Whereas we usually think of things leading to something. But if we think about an outcome, and then we say, okay, that's almost, and that's first, and then the story is written backwards to make it happen. That also makes sense for me. And when it comes to these concepts, at the end of the day, I think the understanding of how life really works remains a mystery. It doesn't need to be understood in a definitive way in order for us to have peace of mind. I think that which is good news, because we're often trying to figure out various mysteries, whereas the freedom can come without figuring out a lot of those things.
Yeah. You mentioned the Zen understanding of awakening and then deliverance. And awakening can be these peak experiences where we get glimpses or, an insight into our true nature. And I remember hearing you speak about an experience of oneness that you had at some point in your journey before meeting Ramesh. I imagine while you were absorbing these Advaita teachings, and then speaking to Ramesh about that experience and having him diminish it or dismiss it, like, Roger, that was just an experience, let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard you say, when you were speaking about that, you were saying, well, he was right. I needed to let that go and not continue craving for that peak experience, because you were, in a way, creating suffering for yourself by trying to get back to that place. And I resonated very deeply with how you described that, because for me, I've had some satoris or some glimpses of truth which have been beautiful and profound and very opening. And there is a part of me that, clings to that and wants to get back to there and experience that again. And when you were describing it as suffering, I can see that process playing out in myself. It is creating suffering in me, because it's like, well, this experience that's happening now is not good enough because it's not the same as what I had back then. So I was wanting to hear your thoughts about that, how that suffering can be created, and then how I would personally see through that and let that go.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the teaching that Ramesh put forward and that I continue to share, one of the main focuses is to keep the seeking practical. That means that if we do that, and if the teaching can support a practical approach to seeking, there is, well, one, maybe more chance of solving a problem because you do things like identify the problem and then look at the problem. And secondly, it means that there's less chance of going off into belief land, which human intellect is very proficient at doing. And so in mystical spirituality, it can be very easy, although there's a great profundity in the mystical spiritual traditions, and they were actually what I found myself moving through, and it delivered. They can also become a trap because some of the experiences lead us to believe that's what it's about. Because once again, our human intellect tends to be focused on something, on on pleasure, essentially, on outcomes, and the peak experience are different, and there's something that they're not necessarily tangible physical form, but there's something that the memory can grab onto, and there's a feeling to them. And that actually is a bit of a problem, because that's not where freedom is to be found, neither in the craving for, obviously not in the craving for it, but it's not even about those states. Ultimately, those states, I think, reveal their glimpses behind the scenes that allow us to carry on with a conviction that, let's say, our true nature is not just physical. And so they're there and they're powerful for that, but they need to be explained in more detail. So keeping the seeking practical. So at the very beginning of the teaching, it's what are you really looking for as a seeker? Have you asked that question? And the problem is that even if a seeker asks that question, often they'll come up with a conditioned answer, and that conditioned answer is often the answer that the suffering stems from. So the teaching sort of says what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living, meaning living life free of suffering. So peace of mind is actually just the absence of suffering. It's not a feeling of great peace or bliss. And so if we need some more rationales to convince us of this, and the teachings should provide that. But ultimately, if we land on the fact that, yes, actually, who am I kidding? Do I really want these amazing peak experiences, or would I be happy with, or would I be satisfied with just being happy? And what might convince us is we find that our seeking often is driven by, as you said, an uncomfortableness, an unhappiness in life. And so really what we're seeking is the end of that. And so if we make seeking about that in a very tangible way, we may have just simplified our project quite a lot. Now, the ego, like that, it often isn't satisfied by that. It wants something much grander. It still wants to be special and different, in grand ways. Eventually, it might come around to the idea, I just want to be happy in life. And what is happiness available? And so the teaching goes on to say, yes, happiness is available, but not in the form of pleasure, not in the form of perfect outcomes, but simply in the absence of our uncomfortableness with ourself, uncomfortableness with the other. And then it will describe the different forms of suffering that disturb that peace of mind. And so liberation is when those forms of suffering and the basis on which they arise have been dismantled. So guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Those are the 5 general labels or categories of suffering. And so if we look at expectation and attachment to outcome, the intellect is very good at saying, oh, that's what I need in order to be happy. And it becomes a given, a truth. And that is one of the misunderstandings of the ego. It's part of the ignorance that's described in wisdom traditions. And it turns out that those different forms of suffering are all attitudes or beliefs about oneself and life. So I need that XYZ in order to be happy, and gets locked away as truth. And that very movement is able to take up its role in seeking, where there is an expectation about what enlightenment looks like, an expectation that, as part of that expectation, says I won't be happy, I can't be happy until I get it, and there'll be lots of other things baked into it. For example, I'm the one that's going to have to make it happen because of my effort. And so whenever we find ourselves being taken through life in ways that don't match that, the attitude is usually one of resistance and firing up. And that firing up is the unhappiness, it's the uncomfortableness. And it can be as simple as recognizing, oh, it's this movement that's been happening for the last 10 hours, let's say, or last 10 days, this attitude towards something that is the problem. And if we were able to just, prick that movement of thought like a balloon, and it suddenly wasn't there, the circumstance would be the same. But the experience meaning on the attitudinal level, the experience of, it turns out, ourself, because this false self exists on this attitudinal relationship to life, would dissolve. So we would still find ourselves needing to function in circumstance. The circumstance would still be as imperfect as it was, but there wouldn't be the uncomfortableness that we're so used to.
Yes.
And so identifying all of these different ways that our attitude to life is suffering is very important, because then our attention starts to land on, the repetitiveness of it, and see the actual problem. And just to finish it up, the attitude at its core that causes suffering is an attitude of attachment and expectation to outcomes, and the belief in personal doership. And so when those beliefs about ourselves and what we need in life are strong, then we're continually superimposing over what is happening in life this interpretation that I am doing it and that I need X, Y, and Z. And the absence of those beliefs means the absence of the attitude that creates the suffering. So then we can start trying to look around and find support in life that starts to undermine those attitudes of doership and attachment to outcomes.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for laying that out. So you mentioned the 5 forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. Do those 5 forms of suffering no longer arise in your daily life experience?
That's been my experience for many years now. Now, that's not to say that the biological reactions to life don't happen. So, if I saw someone moving an expensive vase or something in my house, and in a way that looked like it was going to be problematic, I might shout at, don't do it like that, be careful. Or if someone pushes me, then I could biologically push back in a circumstance, and maybe even get into an argument. And so the distinction between a biological reaction versus psychological reaction is very important. If we have a biological reaction, according to this teaching, it's a momentary or circumstantial interaction. And it hasn't translated into the horizontal psychological suffering that tends to happen when the attitude of personal doership and attachment kicks in. And that psychological suffering extends horizontally in time when the circumstance is over, and it will extend, years after something has happened.
Yes.
Regret about things in the past, expectation about things in the future. And so, some people might be wanting to become perfect human beings like saints, not get angry, not be irritable. Whereas the truth is, when those things happen, it's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes. And if it was aggregated in a day, it might, you might have 5 minutes in a day out of 24 hours. The psychological suffering just is, it accumulates, if we look at it cumulatively, to many, many hours a day, if not the whole waking state. And so this idea that we're waiting to become perfect is another of these expectations. So understanding what liberation is, meaning it's the end of the psychological suffering. So yes, in my experience, feeling shame and regret doesn't exist, doesn't arise on the basis that life has been seen very deeply as being inevitable. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I will function to the best of my ability in a particular circumstance. I'll make decisions to the best of my ability. Now, that my ability might not be very good in certain circumstances. I might make bad decisions, but it's still the best of my ability in that situation, because I am this biological instrument that's a result of factors that were out of my control, my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I didn't pick my genes, I didn't put them in place, I didn't tell them how to function and what to grow into. And I wasn't in control of the bombardment of influences that added to that structure. And so the way I see it is that me and everyone else are functioning exactly as we're designed to function. We can't do anything differently. We can have the thought, oh, I should have done it differently. But that thought to me is completely out of line with the understanding of how life unfolds. And even if life is unfolding as a result of these two factors, the likelihood, so if we move into a much more esoteric explanation and we say life is all happening in the mind of God, then my decisions are God's decisions, essentially. So whichever way I look at it, the system just doesn't have the rationale to grab hold of something and feel like, oh, I should have done it differently. If I thought in the system that I could have done it differently, if that was an option, and the system really believed that there was optionality, then regret makes sense. But when the system just doesn't, the regret doesn't happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. You mentioned the attitude of doership. If I'm not the doer, what am I?
Well, we need to define what doership. So we can start off by, what is Maitreya, the human being, and the description I use is that Maitreya or Roger, any human being, is the impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. And what that means, that's really describing what is happening for Maitreya and Roger, is that we have an experience of personal consciousness, which is our experience of life from our perspective. And that perspective happens because there is a body that is essentially engaging with life. So the body, according to that description, is a vehicle through which the consciousness that doesn't emanate from the body or isn't created by the body the consciousness of source links to the body and then functions through and has the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so doership and non-doership is referring to the attitude that the body mind, so the body has an intellect, and so it's the intellect, part of the biological structure. The intellect has an idea about what's going on. It forms a conclusion. And because of the way the experience is had, or the way the experience happens, from a very young age, we start to feel like I am thinking, because thoughts arise inside what the experience make the thoughts feel like they arise inside the body. And an identification, the experiences make feel like I am the body, and so therefore they are my thoughts and my actions. And so from a young age, whenever the body is moving and speaking and acting and behaving, the attitude is that is my doing. I am the one dictating how everything happens. That would be the attitude of personal doership. The attitude of non-doership is the recognition that the body is a machine that has been programmed, and the play button has been pressed, and essentially the body finds itself in a circumstance and is programmed just like a computer, a computer or a robot is programmed to respond to circumstance. So one of those vacuuming computers or vacuuming robots is programmed to respond when it bumps into a wall. It responds. And the human being is, in this definition, a very complex machine that responds according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning, responds to circumstance. And those responses are essentially what I would describe as predetermined or inevitable. The vacuum robot responds in an inevitable way. It can only respond the way it is designed to respond. And so if we understand that, then the attitude will start to change, where we don't superimpose an attitude of doership onto the robot. We understand that things are happening, that it's moving and that it's carrying out a function, but we don't say that there is someone there choosing and controlling what is happening. So in order to have the human experience, I don't believe that the doership aspect is important. So much like if we were on a train or on a bus being taken on a tour, what is important is the faculty or the functioning of awareness of what is happening. Now, the ego, its mission is to achieve, essentially. So if you take the notion of doership away from the ego, it sort of says like, well, no, what's the point? This is no good. But if we step back from this idea of that might be this egoic, I need to win thing, and say, well, maybe the purpose is something very different. Maybe the purpose is just the experience. And if it's just the experience, then the doership component is not important. In fact, so you can have the experience without being the doer. So I would, when you say, what are we if we're not the doer? I'd say we're the human being. And the human being has a biological aspect to it, which is the functioning, and it's going to be automatic, and it's going to be according to the circumstance and according to your design. But the human being is so much more. The human being is the consciousness. So it's not one or the other, it's the package of both the consciousness and the biological organism. And the human experience is essentially of living as the the complete human, living as or moving in the world as the vehicle, and being aware of that, and simultaneously being able to be connected to yourself, hopefully. Not all human experiences of that part of it, being connected to yourself. And so that's what I would say life's about, and what we are.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I'm just letting the analogy of the vacuum robot land for a little bit because I understand what you're pointing to there. The vacuum robot is operating according to the programming that has been put into it by its manufacturer, and it's not personal. It's just bumping into stuff and doing what it's programmed to do.
Mm-hmm.
I get curious then about so I appreciate there's impersonal consciousness functioning through the biological organism, and the human experience is one of awareness, witnessing what's unfolding. I get curious about how heart and love ties into that experience, because when heart and love are present, for me, they feel very personal. They feel like I'm loving my wife, or I'm loving my son, or my dog, or, my parents. I'm curious how they function in this teaching.
Mm-hmm. So the human being has many aspects to it. So as part of the biological, and I mean, this is one of the limitations of using language. If I'm describing things as biological, then people might hear it and say, "Oh, well, exact. So where do emotions and love fit in?" And so I would say they are biological aspects, or part of the biological functioning of the human being. So we have to broaden our understanding of what biological is capable of. So human beings, as part of their functioning, have the senses. There's the intellect. There are emotions, and then there are also feelings, biological feelings like hunger and tiredness. And so it's the full range of movements that make up the human experience. And there's the need for awareness or consciousness in order for there to be a sense of self and an awareness of all of that range of movement, or that range of expression. So when we interact as humans, which includes this biological interface, when we interact with other humans, we experience emotions and love for those that we're close to, and even a transcendent love for people we don't know, is very much a capacity of the human instrument. And I don't think that needs to be attributed to, there's no problem as far as I'm concerned in attributing it to the biological aspect of things. We just need to understand that the biological is expressed or can express itself in what we call emotions. And then there is that awareness of that as it arises, and an appreciation of that as it arises.
And you mentioned divine love for others that we may not necessarily know. So, my understanding of divine love is that comes from somewhere other than the biology. That comes from, you could say God, or you could say source, or whatever, but it comes from somewhere other than the biology. Is there a mismatch there, or?
No, well, I think that what causes most of the distortions are the addition of the egoic psychological self that seems to be so prevalent in the development of the human story. So something at a very young age seems to happen as a default, where this psychological self gets put in place and then continues to live through life and it by default is uncomfortable with itself. And the good news is it's not what we really are. So that's what the freedom teachings tell us, is that this error has happened, or this movement, maybe, I mean, it's not ultimately an error, but it's a distortion, and it's not what we really are. And if that gets corrected, then we end up with an experience of life that has much more depth, you could say, because it's there's peace and a freedom of uncomfortableness, and that reveals what can be described as a connection to something deeper. So if we look at various things, I think it's more relevant to look at the fact that the psychological self comes in and essentially obscures the capacity of the body, the person, to function in a way that includes, let's say, universal love.
Right.
And then if that falls away, we find we can experience an acceptance for things and for people that mightn't have been available. And where it comes from, whether it comes from, I personally would say no reason to not to, I'm quite happy to say that the biological functioning of the body with the absence of the psychological self is this open view, this open perspective. The reality, though, is when the psychological self does fall away, what we become aware of is the consciousness, and that's why the description is it's the consciousness of source, because we find ourselves inevitably aware of ourselves as something that's not separate, something connected, something we just find ourselves dwelling as something that intuitively does not feel of this world, does not feel like it is of form. And so then you could have the paradox of saying, well, all of the human movements are of God, because the human is never separate from God. And the movements of the human that are of attack and defense and destruction are because of that psychological self creating that distortion.
Yeah, beautiful. One thing that I heard Ramesh say, so this is not something you said, but I'm going to ask you about something Ramesh said and just get your take on it. He said that a sage would never pursue a desire. And I heard him say that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. A sage would never pursue a desire. Because for me, my personal experiences of daily living is having desires all the time and pursuing them. Like, if I want to grow my business to provide for my family, that's a desire and something that I do pursue. And I'm curious about your thoughts on whether that pursuit of any desire stands in the way of self-realization, enlightenment, awakening, whatever term you want to use. But yeah, that pursuit of desire, does that stand in the way?
So once again, it requires us to define certain words, and it's interesting you've brought this up because Ramesh also used to have a sort of criticism about the word desire in Buddhism. In Buddhism, the word desire means attachment, essentially, where there is a craving for the desire. They're one thing. The craving and the desire are the same thing. And so in Buddhism, freedom is the end of desire, which really means the end of attachment in this teaching. So when Ramesh hears some people come with the idea that there should be no desire, what he would say is it's ridiculous to think that the human being is not going to have desire. The human being is always going to have a biological preference, and you're going to feel hungry. And so that hunger is going to create the desire for food. He would then go on to say, but as long as the desire for food doesn't turn into the insistence that life delivers your desire, then you are free from suffering. Now, that clarification he's added on means that the way he's using desire is not the way that the Buddhists are using desire,
Right.
because in Buddhism,
Right.
the desire includes the insistence that life delivers.
Yes.
And sometimes that insistence that life delivers is an insatiable chasing after, pursuing something that we feel that we need. So when Ramesh says a sage would never pursue their desires, he's meaning that attitudinally they won't go after something that's not available. So if someone were to walk past with a plate of something you like at a party or whatever, the sage reaching out to get the food is not what Ramesh would class as pursuing desire. That is life essentially fulfilling the desire by delivering it to you because someone is walking past. And so the movement where you might need to, let's say, go and see a client to build your business is not desire in the, because you're not pursuing your desire in the way Ramesh means. You're just doing what is normal. The lead has come, you've set up the appointment, and you go and meet them. It would be pursuing is if no leads were coming and you found yourself consistently feeling like, I need to create leads. What am I doing wrong? And it then turns into this movement. So that's what he would mean by a sage would never pursue his desires, pursue them beyond the biological movement of getting what is available.
Yes. Okay. No, that makes sense. I appreciate that. Another thing that comes up for me, actually speaking of clients and, going and setting up meetings to look at leads and things, something that's been causing me suffering recently is I'm an accountant, so I run an accounting business, and several of my accountants, too many for my liking, several of my clients, sorry, have been the subject of audits recently by the regulator, and they cause a lot of stress and anxiety and worry in me. And the outcome I'm attached to, if you want to say that, is that they get a positive result in the audit, that everything goes fine and it's all good. And the outcome that I'm really trying to avoid is that there's a quite a negative outcome, and the client loses money, I lose reputation, whatever it is, and there's a whole cascade of negative things that happen. I can see intellectually the possibility of just doing what I feel is the next step to take in order to help my clients prepare for the audit and respond to the audit without needing to have any outcome in mind at all, just in the moment taking the next action. And that sounds nice to me, being able to, have things flow that way. But it is not my experience most of the time. Most of the time, there's a heaviness and an anxiety and a concern. So I wanted to ask you about that. That to me is a clear example of attachment to outcome. How do I let go of that attachment? How do I, deeply go, whatever happens is fine?
So, the question, and I'll point this out just because it's so unconscious, is, we ask, how do I do this? As if, tell me, and then me as the doer can then go and do it. And the thing is in life is that these things are much more complex than we imagine, i.e. the structure that causes that it's a bit like I could say, oh, well, it's the new, one explanation. It might not be the absolute truth, but you could say it happens because of your neurological wiring. The network that's been set up in your mind. So you don't know how to go and change your neurological wiring. I don't. It happens or it doesn't happen. But then we can see how essentially it's new conditioning, and the teachings are just new conditioning that are part of the way the person is. The description is the human being is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And up-to-date conditioning is just the accumulation of the moment-to-moment new conditioning that life is delivering. So if life delivers new conditioning, the up-to-date conditioning is changing. We don't know if it's going to change in a way that is going to, well, we don't know if the change is going to deliver particular outcomes. And so we can't expect to control the situation. However, if there is going to be a change, often it's got to do with new information. So that's what the teachings aren't speaking to a doer. They're just delivering new conditioning. The new conditioning lands one way or another, and maybe certain changes follow. So it's important to know that the flow of life, meaning circumstance that happens day after day after day and through the days, is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That's the nature of circumstance. We're not going to be able to escape from, while we're alive as human beings, the body has its biological preferences. And so the body with its biological preferences is put out into the world, and the outcomes that happen or the circumstance is either pleasurable or painful. If the circumstance is very cold and the biological preference is, not so cold, then that is pain in the moment. The biological preference includes financial pleasure and not financial pain. And so if you're in a situation where someone steals your money, or you carry out a job and it ends up costing you money, that is financial pain. And so financial pain is painful. It's just a fact of life. And so we can't expect financial pain or other forms of biological pain to not be part of life from time to time. So the mix is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. The suffering, on the other hand, is our attitude to that pleasure and pain. And so understanding that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain is a very important step, because our attitude then will be one where, if the potential for pain exists, we say, yeah, that's life. So I can't control that. I can't control what the outcome ultimately is. What I can do is my best. And so you'd say, I'm going to do my best. And that then is the step-by-step process, both before and after. And the rest is up to God. So some of those simple recognitions that, life is going to deliver whatever is destined. I can't control that. If that event happens, then it will be painful. But the truth is that my happiness and my completeness is not dependent on whether life is pleasurable or painful, which means that outcome is not really an attack on my true self. It is an attack to the psychological self. Pain is an attack. That's why we feel anxiety, because we essentially are living as the psychological self, where the ignorance that outcome is an attack on who I am exists. And so then there is a fear, and that fear is presents as anxiety and expectation, or trying to control the future.
Yeah, wow, I really appreciate that answer. it's such a radical shift in attitude. Like it's such a 180 compared to a lot of teachings that I've been exposed to, which say that there there is somewhere to get, and you are responsible for getting to that place. And you need to follow the practices. You need to do the work in order to get to that place. And this this thing that you're describing is like the complete opposite of that. Is like, not only is there no doer, there's nothing that you can do to like if there's going to be psychological pain, that's just life. Like it just takes away all of the undercurrent of responsibility, doership, ownership of the problem, and just leaves acceptance and surrender in what I'm hearing from you. So that's just an observation, but yeah, just noticing the complete 180. I also wanted to ask you about, because there are some teachings, particularly in the Invita world, which will say that you are not the separate self. And in those teachings, I can follow them in my experience. I can meditate, I can focus on the breath, and then I can look for the separate self and notice in my direct experience that it's not there. I can't find it anywhere. I can sense my breath, I can sense my body, I can sense the room, I can notice thoughts and feelings arise, but there's no separate self that I can go, oh, there's the I. And I wanted to ask you about the teaching that says everything is predetermined by God, and whether there's a similar mechanism by which I can observe that in my experience and come to know that deeply.
Yes. If the predetermined part is more confusing to start with, because that we can add that in as an implication afterwards. So there are teachings that say, and Advaita essentially says this, and this teaching is an Advaita teaching. It just is approaching it from the bottom-up approach.
Yes.
Meaning we're looking at it. So a lot of Advaita teachings won't acknowledge or causality and form and the person. They tend to get relegated into the realm of the unreal, and they are pointing to the formless in order to bring attention out of what has been attention has been focused on for its whole life, and all it is essentially able to be aware of, and to get awareness to turn inwards and recognize itself. So that's why a lot of teachings diminish or relegate certain things into the realm of unreality. The explanation that they would put forward in those teachings is that life is God. God has become life. So in Advaita, it's all there is God. All there is Brahman. And that's very hard for us, when the human separate experience hears that. At best you could say, oh, well, not really at best, but often we say, well, that sounds like an interesting notion. But, the point is, it needs to be more than an interesting notion. It needs to be a realization. And those teachings are saying that with the intention that it is realized, and that it becomes believed where you just say it, but it has to be real. And that was your question: is there something that can be done for it to be known in the same way as I can't find a separate self when the thinking mind subsides, or at least when there's no involvement in the thinking that might be happening? And the, the the answer is yes, and it's very profound, and it's not too much different from meditation, but it may require some retweaking of some of the notions that we have carried into meditation, notions that we've carried through our whole life. So, when you said that you're in meditation and there is awareness of the body, well, we can challenge that and say, well, when you're sitting in meditation, just be aware that there is sensation, and don't superimpose onto that sensation using your memory and assumption of how life is. Because as soon as we feel a sensation in the meditation space and we say, that is my shoulder, and then on the other side is another shoulder and I can feel a sensation, and that is my thigh touching the chair, we essentially are rebuilding the world of form in the meditation, even though it's not completely there. So if we realize, yes, there's sensation, but what is it really telling me? If we go into the sensation, it's really quite nebulous and doesn't have definition and boundaries. A lot of those boundaries are your interpretation of what the sensation is. So the attention goes on to the sensation of what we would call leg touching chair, and we realize there is no leg and there is no chair, there's just a sensation. And so we may then become aware in meditation that there is a space or spaceless space, but there's something very crucial there, which is awareness of whatever arises in that space, including these nebulous sensations, and thought, and maybe weird colors, depending on what the meditation happens to be. The important point I'm trying to make is that it is an aware space. It is a space in which experience happens. And life is a space in which experience happens, the waking state. And the dream state at night is a space in which experience happens. The sages have been pointing out that the waking state and the dream state are essentially exactly the same. It is the same consciousness, and for that matter, the deep sleep state. It is the same background of consciousness, and the content is different. The content that we know as daily life creates the experience of daily life. The content in a dream creates the dream experience. Now, our assessment of daily life is that there is this physical body that has the capacity to see outside what is out there. And so our relationship to tables and chairs is that we are seeing the tables and chairs that are out there. It is possible, if life keeps reinforcing it, that the waking state is an experience. The waking state is consciousness appearing as the waking state, as it happens to appear, creating the impression of the waking state, creating the impression of form, the impression of space and time, the impression of a human object. Now, bringing in dreams and realizing that in a dream, we have a relationship to a dream, and we say the dream happens in mind, the mind of the dreamer, the one asleep. But it's good for us to examine what happens in a dream, and that mountains and rivers can suddenly appear, and the vista might be of hundreds of meters of ocean, and all of that is appearing inside mind. So mind can accommodate space, essentially. That space is not primordial. Space is secondary, and what's primordial is the mind that can accommodate the appearance of time and space. So if we start to see how in a dream a whole world can come into existence, and it's really just experience in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Now we need to start applying the possibility, at least the thought, is that what's happening in the waking state?
Mm.
And if the intellect, it starts off with the intellect, and then it becomes an investigation that turns into a meditation, the awakening is an awakening to the fact that the images are exactly that. They are appearances in consciousness, in mind.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
experientially, the way that the waking state is experienced can change such that the very awareness that is aware of it becomes known to itself and remains known as the fundamental basis on which each moment is happening. That if the awareness wasn't there, the whole present moment would collapse.
Mm.
That awareness is fundamental to our life experience. And we can know that awareness is what we are, i.e., that awareness has intrinsic in it the I, not the I thought, but it's when you said there's no I in meditation, ironically, there's no small I or small self. But what you're left with when you're meditating is an undeniable I am, like I exist, not I Maitreya, but whatever is aware in that meditation, it is. And so that can become available in the waking state, where the deeply ingrained assumption that gets put in place that I, the body, am the subject, and that the physical form are all objects outside of the subject, that flips to a perspective where I am the formless subject that always is, and the content is one with it. It's the content is arising inside that formless awareness that I am. So that's the appreciation or the realization, the experiential shift that can happen, and that then leads to an appreciation, just like in a dream. If you were aware in your dream that it's a dream, that the dream is going to unfold exactly as it's created to unfold, which we can then, you could use the word, the dream is predetermined, especially from the point of view of the character in the dream. So if we know the dream is an appearance in consciousness, and the character in the dream knows it's a dream and knows it is just that, it as the character is part and parcel of the dream, is not separate from the dream. It has been created along with the river and the birds that might be flying across the sky.
Okay, so I just want to ask you a further question there, can I? Because I
Yes.
feel like you're setting up something, and I can see where you're leading to in the argument that you're laying out. But what you're describing there is from the perspective of the character, everything in the dream is predetermined, and that's not always my experience while dreaming. When I'm dreaming, it feels like I can interact with my dream and I can change things, and I have some sense of agency and control. So I'm not necessarily agreeing with you when you say that in the dream state, it's all predetermined.
Well, that's if you've found a capacity to lucid dream, right? If that's been practiced, usually in a dream, the dream character has no idea it's a dream, and there's no experience of changing anything. So it's very much as if it were real life, where something is happening to you essentially in the dream. So if there's
it's also like real life where something is happening to me, but I can respond to that thing and I have choices in those responses. That's my experience of dreaming.
right, but the choice, so what you're talking about is that someone might come up to you in the dream and say, would you like to buy some drugs? And you as the main character might suddenly feel an anxiety because you're not used to that world, and you very much feel like, oh, no, thanks, not for me. And that's your response, and then they move off, and you might have the thought in the dream, oh, that what a relief that was, didn't turn into anything, for example. So very much like in normal everyday life, I guess, is what you're saying. You have the feeling.
Yes.
Yeah. So in normal everyday life, the way that the story unfolds, as is the case in a dream, is that the dream includes decisions, or what we call decisions, as part of the mechanism of how the thing unfolds. Just like in a novel, there will be interactions and decisions, but the decision is not my decision, but rather part of the unfolding of the dream. Now, it feels like, anxiety arises, and it feels like I decide to say, oh, no, not for me, thanks. And that the fact that something feels a particular way is not necessarily proof that it is that way. Sure. And that's what we need to sort of move past. And that's what Maya in the Indian tradition is pointing at. It is the illusion of something that is that creates the confusion. So that's why the belief in personal doership is so strong, is because it feels like I am deciding. But if we look at the fact that a thought arises and then we speak, and did we create the thought, or did the thought happen? And then if we start moving back in the sequence of things, we might start to realize, oh, it just appears like I had the decision, but really the decision happened. And we can witness that happening. So in the night dream, yes, the character will make a decision, but from the perspective of the character, which doesn't mean how the character feels, but if we are looking at a dream from outside and understanding what's happening, we know that the character is not the creator. The character is a player in the dream, and like a character in the novel, they will do exactly what they are destined to do in the dream. This is if we are looking, not if we're looking as the character, but understanding what a dream is.
Yes.
We don't attribute any agency to the dream characters. If we're going to attribute agency, we're going to attribute agency to the one creating the dream. In our normal estimation, that would be Maitreya sleeping, is the creator. And what you're creating is a story. And from the perspective of the characters in the story, that story is essentially predetermined, whether they realize it or not, or whether they feel like it or not. So the analogy is that life is also a creation of source, and we are the characters in it. And we don't feel like we're characters in it. We don't feel like it's all predetermined, but that may be the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
But that's why there are the inclusions of the less esoteric like genes
Sure,
and
sure.
genes.
Yeah.
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 So if it's not palpable or acceptable for someone to just run with, let's say it's all predetermined, or they don't have certain experiences that would confirm or demonstrate,
Yes.
then we can just go back to the more causal explanations of
Yes.
genes and up-to-date
Yes.
conditioning. Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. And when you were describing from a certain perspective, the body is the subject and I'm experiencing objects around me, but then you step back and really the subject is the I am, the impersonal I am, and the body is the object, and mind is an object in that awareness as well as everything else. There's a shift in perspective there that I find very useful, and I can intellectually accept that as a different perspective than what is generally considered to be the human experience. And also, in meditation, watching the thought arise and then considering, did I actually think that thought, or did the thought just appear in my awareness? And really, I don't think any thoughts. They all just appear to me, and then my mind will do with them whatever it does with them, but it's not really me doing anything. So I can grok those. I'm just struggling with the dream analogy, but that's okay. We don't necessarily have to clarify that right now. I'm just noticing that that's taking a little while to land in me. Um, the I want to ask about energetic transmission. Some teachers feel really, really palpably when I interact with them, I feel a sense of silence arising in me and this strong pull into awareness. And I like that experience. It's a nice experience. And I'm interested in your perspective on the value of that energetic transmission between student and teacher. What do you see as the value of that?
Well, it can help bring someone into a place that on their own they might not have access to. So it can I was trying to think of a good analogy, but well, a bit like if you've got a flat battery in your car and you jump start it with another battery, by putting the jumper leads on, you are lifting up the energy of the flat battery essentially.
Yes.
And it can be something like that, coming into the space of someone who is grounded in their own presence can help bring a connection to one's own presence. So if you have a teacher that meditates or remains as that awareness a lot of the time, which doesn't have to be the case, because liberation or enlightenment, as according to the definition here, is not living as formless awareness, but essentially being in touch with that, and living as the human being without the psychological structure in place.
Yes.
However, some people are going to have a preference to remain in meditative states a lot more of the time.
Yes.
And that might create a more palpable sense of the formless when you come in contact with them, which doesn't make them more or less liberated. It just
Sure.
means that their personality means that they, or it might not be personality, but destiny, whatever, is that's where they're going to dwell more of the time.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
And it's also very affected by the type of teaching that the person is putting across. So I'm putting across a lot of concepts, and it is going to engage the intellect. And that engaging of the intellect is by default often going to, unless the concepts are concepts of, you are not this, you are not the body, you are formless awareness. If it's those concepts, though, they are likely to create that shift into that
Yes.
that formless space. Whereas if the concepts are much more logical, sequential, form-based, daily life-based, they will tend, that exchange will tend to keep the experience you mentioned of sort of opening up and moving into silence, keep it at bay, or not foster it that much. But you know that there's a good and a bad part with having that experience. One is it can allow you to see from a perspective that is not necessarily easily available, and that can help support a deepening of and a conviction of what's available for you. But it can also lead to a sort of addictive need to be around a teacher because that's where that is available. And so I see that the concepts as information, they might not create that experience. We can have, you know, specific sessions and meditation where the concepts are not what is focused on. But I feel it's very important to provide tools that then enable the intellect to become capable of undoing itself.
Yeah.
Eventually, the intellect learns to be quiet. It realizes it isn't what solves most of life's important problems. So it starts to remain quiet.
Yeah. I appreciate the contrast you're pointing out there between, let's say, a teacher whose style of teaching is to keep the intellectual concepts to a minimum and just do the pointing to awareness, and your style, which is more about giving someone the tools to recognize the way life is unfolding from a more clear perspective in order to undo a lot of that psychological self that is getting in the way of that experience most of the time.
Yes.
And yeah, the way you describe your experience with Advaita and then coming into contact with Ramesh and then coming back to a more practical peace of mind in daily living perspective appeals to me in the sense that it appears to me as though you're not excluding anything. You're not saying thoughts are not real, the body's not real, none of this is real. You're including the perspective of formless awareness and the practical form that is living daily life. Whereas some teachers who will just point to the formless will say things like, thoughts are not real, body's not real, you're not that. And it's an exclusionary way of teaching. So you are only meant to focus on what is taken to be real, which is that which is unchanging. And it can, in my experience, it can create a spiritual bypass where we skip over a lot of human experience, particularly wounding, trauma, things that are uncomfortable, in order to just remain as that. And yeah, that can be dangerous from a certain perspective if it's heard by someone and taken to be the truth without digesting it themselves in their own system and investigating it themselves and arriving at that place themselves. That spiritual bypass is a very real possibility.
It's a huge possibility. It's almost an inevitability. I don't have an issue with the teachings that do exactly what you said. In fact, I think they're very powerful. They use it's a methodology. It's a methodology that's very powerful. And this is a methodology that has its reasoning as well. And none of them are good enough on their own, really. I think seeking is very much a movement that happens, and one teaching sort of hands over to another. And sometimes it's going this way and sometimes it's going that way. So for some people, one will come before the other. And they work in conjunction with each other. So I don't think teachings really should be in the job of criticizing each other, but rather
Sure,
see how
sure,
they all work together at different points in time.
sure.
But they all have their shortcomings as well, and bypassing, where you sort of find yourself escaping essentially, is something that happens. Usually it happens after that has created an ability to rest in being and
Yes,
just drop out of thinking. And then at
yes.
some point, it's like, okay, but now that's not the appropriate movement anymore. So it was the appropriate movement, able to create that, the familiarity and the ability to drop into being. And then at some point, the thing that was so useful becomes overused, let's say. So then inevitably there's still a lot in the system even after that awakening. And so returning to the body, which can feel very unpleasant, that's why we suddenly want to go back out there again. It's at some point it's time to come back and see what's left. And that's why having a more a set of descriptions that focus on describing things that are still understood from the awakened Advaita perspective, but in relation to living as the human being, is very useful. And I've seen people who clearly have had awakenings and are able to abide in beingness. But then as soon as you talk about pleasure and pain, for example, I feel that the descriptions that come back are so confused because they haven't had the advantage of a teaching that actually focuses on that I can't but conclude that if there's that level of confusion in the intellect, that the process is not complete.
Yes.
You can't have someone that just doesn't acknowledge the pleasure and pain of the flow of life, for example. And the awakening teachings needed to, at some point, say there is no such thing as pleasure and pain, right? That is one of the methodologies that is useful at breaking attachment to pleasure and pain. Now, it's not true. That's not the truth. But the statement that there is no pleasure and pain means we stop focusing on pleasure and pain. And when we focus on pleasure and pain with the old structure, we are attached to pleasure and pain. So instead of trying to break the attachment, it will just say there is no such thing as pleasure and pain. It just is. And so it's a useful methodology, but it has its shortcoming because it at some point we need to say, well, there will always be biological pleasure and pain, and the attachment is a secondary movement.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. Roger, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and it's been a fascinating conversation for me to get to understand the teaching a little bit deeper. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, and all the best with the audits as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Cheers.